morning. This is Monday, June 8th, 2020. Apologize for not getting any of these devotionals done last week. It was a very busy week at work, and I expect to have another pretty busy week this week. So I did this one on Sunday afternoon, and I'll try to get another one done this week sometime, but I make no promise. But stay tuned. I will poke them in every once in a while. Today we're going to be looking at Micah chapter 4. Uh, if you remember, in Micah chapter 3 was all about the wickedness that had become so commonplace in Israel and Judah. As a result of that wickedness, God had said in the last verse of chapter 3, "Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the Temple Hill a mound overgrown with thickets." A reminder of God's plan for that part of the world, his destruction that was coming because of the sin of his people. Now, as we enter chapter 4, the scene changes, and God begins to talk about a far distant future time. While not all Christian groups agree on when this future time will be or how it will happen, and many other related questions, all agree that it is a clear picture of God's ultimate victory through the Messiah. I like to think of it as a description of the Messianic kingdom or the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Let's take a look at this description of that incredible time. The chapter begins with, this is Micah chapter 4 now, verse 1. It begins with, "in the last days." That phrase is a fairly common phrase throughout the Bible. It's used in Hosea chapter 3, where it says there, "They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days." Isaiah uses it in chapter 2, where he quotes almost word for word these verses 1 to 3 in his chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. We're not sure who wrote it first, but it's both spoken through the Holy Spirit, God's message being reiterated twice through two different prophets. The passage is also used in the New Testament by Peter, Paul, and James to refer to a future time that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24. In those contexts, it seems to point toward the tribulation period rather than the millennium. But in either context, we understand that it will be part of God's plan to set things right in a world that has been devastated by sin and the suffering that sin has produced. Micah goes on with a reference to the mountain of the Lord's temple. The mountain of the Lord's temple would have been understood in his day as a reference to Mount Zion or the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And many believe that it will one day be the center, or the capital, if you will, of Christ's kingdom during the millennium. I don't mean to dispute that, but it's interesting to note that in 1 Corinthians 6:19, our bodies are referred to as the temple of the Lord. Play with that a little bit and see how it fits for you. Continuing, Micah says, "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and peoples will stream to it." The reference to the highest mountain probably refers to the worship of other gods of that day. That worship often occurred on a hill or a mountaintop, and the higher the mountain, the greater the god. Here God says that he will be established as the greatest of all. And he says that people will stream to him. They will abandon all other gods to honor the true God. He says in verse 2, "Many nations will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths.' The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Note the desire, the enthusiasm among the many nations to learn the way of God. And the reason for wanting to learn is so that they can walk in his paths. In other words, they want to obey. That's an important lesson for us to take note of. All too often, Christians today view obedience as a burden that they need to bear. It shouldn't be that way. Jesus said, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." Pray for a heart that has a burning desire to please him, to obey him. Verse 3 and 4 give a description of the kingdom that Christ, the Messiah, will rule over. It says, he will judge between many peoples. Jesus Christ will be that judge. The Messiah will judge between the people. And it says he will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. Today, we know many disputes that go on among the nations. There are arguments, there are things that lead to war. And civilizations have been devastated by this throughout the centuries. But he continues here, says the end of verse 3, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. In other words, they will no longer need the implements of war. And those implements will be converted for a useful means to be put to good use. It says, nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. It's a picture of a peaceful world under the rule of the Messiah, the just, peaceful, fair, kind Messiah. The kind of world I want to live in. The kind of world that has been dreamt of for eons by all peoples. It's a promise that God will bring to be. He says in verse 4, everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree. In other words, in this world, people will be secure. They will have their own income. They'll be comfortable. There'll be wealth. He says, and no one will make them afraid. They will not need to be afraid of anything. The passage, this verse concludes with, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. It's almost like God signing his name to it. He looked over the shoulder of Micah, saw what he wrote, and God signs it. That's what's going to happen. That's what we have to look forward to. Verse 5 appears to be a comment that Micah inserts, indicating his awe at the promises God is making and his desire to be part of it. He says, all the nations may walk in the name of their gods, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. We want to be faithful to our God so that we can be part of his kingdom. Then God continues with the description. In verse 6, it says, in that day, declares the Lord, again, God signing it, declares the Lord, I will gather the lame. I will assemble the exiles and those I have brought to grief. I will make the lame my remnant, those driven away into a strong nation. The Lord will rule over them in Mount Zion from that day and forever. God promising not to forget his people. He will gather them once again, even though they are being devastated now. He will gather them again one day. In verse 8, God turns his attention back to the Israel and the Judah of Micah's day and renews his commitment to their exile as punishment for their sins. He concludes in verse 10 with a statement of what will happen, but also with the hope of a more distant future. He says in verse 10, writhe in agony, daughter Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you must leave the city to camp in the open field. You will go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you out of the hand of your enemies. But then he comments on those nations that will defeat his people. And he seems to indicate that while they are accomplishing his purpose, they do not do it in his way. He says in verse 12, but they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan. And he goes on after that to describe their destruction. Micah chapter 4 is an interesting chapter. I particularly like it because it reminds us that God has a plan, and he's bringing his plan to completion. That's important for us to remember in this crazy, mixed up world that we live in. Our world seems to be riddled with division and deceit, fear and anger and mistrust and hatred. It's easy to lose track of who's in charge. This passage reminds us that even in the midst of what looks like total chaos, God is still there. He has a plan. He's in control. It's a good plan, and he will bring it to completion. This week, if things get you down, remember the kingdom of justice and peace that God will bring. It is coming. God has a plan. It's a good plan. He will bring it to be. God bless you in the week ahead.